Give me a second. All right. Let's go. So I'm going to have one of those days where everything's just going to not want to work, but I couldn't believe the deer this morning. It's still kind of out there, just hanging out. I just thought that was like really cool.
Do you live rural or?
Yeah, I live on top of a mountain, so I mean, it's not unlikely. Usually, it's the turkeys.
Yeah.
Usually, they're just mean. Like just like they'll come after you.
Now, where are you out of?
So I live in upstate New York, about an hour north of Albany, Lake George area. And then I also have a house in Massachusetts in Townsend. So it's super northern Mass.
Yeah.
So we kind of are going through. So we are just about live here. I'm seeing we are live on everything else. I'm just waiting for Instagram to connect because Instagram's been some sort of way today. Like it's been very finicky. So we'll see here. I'm just waiting for my little button to pop up. There we go. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for the third time today. I'm so glad you hang around. So today, now we are talking with Salicrow, and she has a new book that is out, Spirit Speaker, and it is published by Inner Traditions. Because like I said, I'm doing an Inner Traditions Author Fest today, and I'm loving every minute of it. And, it's awesome for me too, because I live, I travel through Vermont all the time. I'm right near Vermont. I love Vermont. So I always love like when the authors are close by. It just makes me feel good. I love it.
Yeah.
Everybody, a lot of times people I'm interviewing, they're, all over the world, but they're mostly on the West Coast and all that. So when I have like local people, it makes me so happy. I love it. So thank you for coming on today. And so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little about what you do?
Sure. My name is Salicrow, and I am a psychic medium. I have been wearing my gifts my entire life. My first teacher was my grandmother. I've worked publicly for 30 years, well, 30 plus at this point. And I have written, I'm a druid, I'm a witch. I've written 3 books. Spirit Speaker is my latest. And last year I put out The Path of Elemental Witchcraft. My first book, Jump Girl, and the Initiation Art of a Spirit Speaker, was a memoir of my life. So I grew up psychic. I've worked in the field. I've taught. I teach a lot of psychic development classes, magic classes, healing classes, all sorts of stuff.
Awesome. I love that. Just, the little bit of everything going on there.
Yeah.
Just that, and I kind of feel like any, practicing witch, we're kind of like that. And people are always like, well, what do you do? And it's like, oh, geez, everything. Like it's all the things. But today we're going to talk about your newest book. So we have Spirit Speaker. So why don't you, before I even dive in, why don't you describe what a Spirit Speaker is to everybody?
Well, a Spirit Speaker is a medium, but people use the word medium to describe a lot of things. They use you're technically a medium or a channel if you're channeling energy for healing. Right. And I find that sometimes even people who say that they are a psychic medium may not always be delivering messages from spirit. They might be, sometimes they're giving a message from spirit, sometimes it's from the person's higher self. I separate out my abilities. I have done divination for the public since I was 18 years old, so for over 30 years. And when I do spirit communication, I'm literally talking to people's beloved dead. And I've done that for over 20 years for the public. I have my Reiki master in 6 schools of Reiki. I really am a healer above everything else. So like the way that I approach psychic readings, the way that I approach spirit communication, it's all about healing. So a spirit speaker is somebody who's literally speaking to spirits. And to separate out that word medium or channel from somebody who might be, getting a download from a higher self or something else.
Right, right. And yeah, and I think that's important to kind of define that a little bit, because with media, with TV and movies, I feel like people have a really confused view on what that is exactly.
Yes, it has
Right,
gotten we're living in a time where all of our terminology is changing, not just in the metaphysical world. I mean, we are living in a time where, gender is changing, how we approach things are changing, our concepts are changing. And so we're needing to I like to have really clear words of description
yeah.
because I built my career word of mouth, and I've always been part of my community, so like I have really normal clients, like, people who are nurses and waitresses and doctors and police officers and, normal people.
Right.
Um, and so when I talk about anything in my books or in any way that I'm teaching or presenting information, I go out of my way to make sure that I'm really clear about this is what I mean when I say this. When I'm talking about magic, this is science that hasn't yet been explained. When I'm talking about, spirit communication, I'm talking about talking with the beloved dead. This is my, can I talk to other spiritual beings? Yes. My work is primarily based in working with people's beloved dead and helping people who are in deep states of grieving and mourning.
Right, right. And that is definitely one thing I did notice with your book too, is that everything is explained so clearly. And I love that. I really have a soft spot for working with afterlife, death, dying, all of that. My one of my jobs, before I kind of was doing all this full time, I was an OBGYN nurse, and I was kind of the death doula for the babies. So when babies
That's a
passed
big
on,
one.
yeah, so I would prepare them and talk to the parents and all of that. And I just loved, as I was going through, even the part about repairing the body and all of these things, that even when I was working on other floors, and when an older person had passed, just the rushing of the whole thing, and I would hate,
Mm,
it would break my heart, because it was like, okay, and right now in my head, the one that's sticking out, an older gentleman passed away. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the sun was just coming into the windows and just kind of engulfing him, and he passed away. And then all of a sudden it was rush, 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 like things were clanging and things, and I was just like, wait a minute, can we just like give it this moment to let
right,
this moment, like just the scene of it visually, to kind of happen. And I got a lot of crap from the other nurses, because they're like, oh, we need to clean this up, somebody else needs this room, and all of that. So
right.
when it really actually made me think of that, in particular, when I was reading that part about preparing the body and all of that, and your story with your grandfather and all of, and it just, it was something that I hadn't thought about in a really long time, so I thought that was like really kind of a cool thing for that to come up. And and when I was working with babies and all of that, I really made sure to try to bring that in there and not rush it, and not
Mhm.
try to make it like, okay, well, it's over, so let's, and because it's not, for them, it's another chapter just beginning, right?
Exactly. Especially
Right.
working with children, because that, in my opinion, is the hardest death that anybody will ever experience is the death of a child.
Mhm.
And that is something that will stick with people. They can move on with their life to a certain extent, but they'll always bring that piece with them.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't understand their rights when it comes to working in a hospital if your loved one dies in a hospital. But there's a little secret thing that you can say, which is, this is part of my spiritual tradition or my religious beliefs. And that
Yes.
will make everybody slow down and
Mhm.
give you the time that you need, because no hospital wants to stir up a bunch of trouble around religious discrimination.
Oh, absolutely. And after that one particular thing, that was, I always, and I worked nights, so there wasn't a lot of people around, but once the morning came, and if that person still wanted their baby in the room at that time, and that was my go-to for sure. I was always saying, I'm like, listen, this is what we're going to say right now. You're not ready yet. There's no reason to rush you. And
Right.
I think too, even just throughout your book, just kind of like the base of it too is like, don't rush this. Let these
Mhm.
things happen as they're supposed to. And we forget that, and we're such a rush society, and we forget that, no, it's okay to like stop and be mindful of what's going on, right?
I also
And
think it prolongs the mourning, or the being, people can get really stuck in their grieving because we've eliminated so many of the ways that we celebrate our dead, so many ways that we interact with, like you said, we've rushed it all, not just in the hospital, but it's now, it's what, three, like a wake, of funeral, and 2 weeks of casseroles. Well, there's many cultures where we would actually sit with our dead for 3 days,
right,
where somebody is actually sitting with them. And and I've been involved in things like that, where, sitting with the dead, and, giving that respect. And I also, in 2017, when I was in Northern Ireland, I was staying with friends of the family, and they had a pub that had been in the family since the 1500s. Well, the owner, who was the barkeep, was also an undertaker, because wakes and funerals were traditionally done in, public places where people could celebrate together. And
right,
while that's kind of a dying breed, those kind of things made death more a natural part of our life. Now we take it and we want to like hide it somewhere. We want to, like you said, move through it as quickly as we can, and then move past it, because nobody wants to dwell on death.
right. And that's probably the biggest mistake that we are all making right now, is that, because like you said, just in, whoever is living on and in their grieving process, it just makes, I feel like it just makes it so much more intense. It lasts longer, and then they're not as open to receive messages after
Right.
this person is passed on, right? Like, I
Yeah.
feel like it just almost blocks it in that way.
Yeah. I talk about that a lot, because it doesn't happen very often, but I will meet people who I describe it as they've hardened their aura. And, the first time this ever happened, I was doing a seance for a group of people. And for me, seances are small, intimate groups in which, for the most part, I'm guaranteeing a message comes through for everybody. So usually groups about 6 to 10 people.
Hmm.
And one person had no spirits around them whatsoever. And I had never really experienced that. And I was like, something is not right about this. So I
Right.
finally said to him, I was like, look, I was like, you must have somebody that you want contact with very badly. I was like, I'm going to need you to say their name for me. Tell me who you're looking for. And he was looking for his grandmother who had raised him. And when he said that, it was like a wall came down. She was able to come through very clearly. But it was when I started being able to recognize that sometimes people could actually be blocking their, and I knew it because people of, experiences out there, but this was like how I visually was able to perceive it and go, okay, this is what's actually happening. But that's why we have people who, they think that their loved one's mad at them because, your siblings are experiencing your dad. Hey, the lady you work with is describing your dad and saying she's seeing your dad. Why isn't your dad talking to me? Why isn't he talking to me? Was he mad at me? And it's like, no, chances are your pain is actually hardening the energetic, field around you, because you want it so badly that you're so afraid it won't happen that you're preventing it from being able to happen.
Right. That's so true. And honestly, I was doing a reading a couple months ago, and that was the exact question. And it was her mother, and she was just like, I don't understand. My sister, my neighbor, everybody, and why not me? Why not me? And really, that's exactly what it was. And I kind of sent her on her way, had her try a couple different things, and which was really just basically giving herself permission to receive.
Right.
Because, as a healer, which I'm sure you've experienced too, the amount of times that you give somebody permission to do what they're innately able to do anyway, it's crazy. It's just so crazy, but we're conditioned that way now. And it's amazing to me that I have to be like, no, you absolutely can do that. I don't need to tell you can do it. And then they look at you like, oh, okay.
Well, I think that people expect for things to be, when it comes to any kind of psychic phenomenon, I think people expect it's going to be harder than it is, and so the subtle ways in which they are receiving information, they overlook because they're waiting for the neon sign or, the Disneyfied version of it, because that's the problem with media and television and movies, is that in order for everybody to be able to perceive magic, it has to come with lights and special effects and
stars from the sky, the whole thing.
Right? And the reality of it is sometimes that stuff happens, but when it's happening, it's usually happening inside of our mind. It's happening in the astral realm. It's not that we're actually shooting firebolts out of our hands but we're able to use, we are able to use that kind of kinetic energy, because how many people are doing Reiki nowadays?
Right.
We are using kinetic energy. We're using energy that we're channeling from the universe. We are doing something, but there's not as many light effects. There's not as much, like gasping as the person's being worked on. Sometimes there is. Sometimes
no, it does. Yeah, no, you're right. It does happen, but it's not the norm. Like, don't expect it, right?
Right, exactly. But it's not going to be the Hollywood version,
Right.
And I think that that's really where people struggle with whether they're really receiving information or not, is because they doubt. They doubt so much. And like you said, that's been conditioned in, that's been programmed into us, that we can't trust ourselves, that these things aren't, don't happen. Or even if they do happen, they happen to people like you or people like me who, like one of the things I joke about is how many things people accept about me because I'm psychic. I think they put them all in the same category. It's normal for you to work with other gods.
Yes.
You're psychic. It's almost like you're
so
not
true.
the same as other people. So you do that. Of course you do, but that wouldn't be okay for me. But you, I expect that. When my first book came out, I went to, which was a memoir of my life growing up psychic, I went to the Arkansas Literary Festival, which I thought was really strange because it's a pretty, Bible Belty area.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And the first night there was like this meet and greet with authors, like people could pay to have dinner and drinks with us or something. It was kind of strange, but interesting, except for it was the South. So everybody who would ask me about my book, when I would tell them, that it was my memoir of my life and that I had, growing up psychic, and they would kind of look at me and then back off just a little bit or turn a little bit. And then I would finish my sentence and I would say, well, I was raised this way because, my family, my great grandmother was half Irish Traveler, half Blackfoot, Native American. And as soon as I said that, I literally had people who would turn back and go, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense for you. Like somehow, because they could put it into a category of other.
Right.
You're other than me, so it makes sense for you.
Yeah.
All of these other things. But I think that's the thing that we got to get over, is that it's not that we're other. Everybody has this potential to some degree. It's not something that only happens to a few of us. Almost all of us have some form of spirit contact with our beloved dead. Yeah. And many of us don't recognize it. We doubt it. One of the first things I tell my students is to take the words maybe, kind of, and think so out of your vocabulary when you're talking about your experiences, because people will say things like, I saw something out of the corner of my eye and I think it might have been a spirit. It's like, well, wait a second, let's say this without that word think. And then they'll say, I saw something out of the corner of my eye and it was a spirit. And I'm like, okay, so how does that feel? And they're like, I saw something out of the corner of my eye and it was spirit, because by saying it in the affirmative, they can feel that that was an actual real experience. Yeah. So for people who are opening up even just for their own contact or opening their ability in divination or anything, it's like taking the doubtful words out and keeping a journal, a book of shadows of your experiences and going back over it. Those are like the most important things across the board.
Yes, I am 100% behind that. I will tell you, no, like, I rather you write it down with pen and paper because I'm a pen and paper person and I feel like there's magic in that. But also, I'm like, listen, if you're out and about, write it in the notes in your phone. Do
Yeah,
an
and
auto,
actually,
anything.
like, I have a lot of younger students, and almost all of my younger students they use their notes on their phone as
Right.
their journal. And I can say that I don't always do that, but I went to a class that I took on building a fairy well, and this is part of the fairy faith. It was a class with Orion Foxwood, and he's a friend of mine.
Yeah.
And I went and I didn't have my notebook with me, so I had to do it in my phone. But you know what? That was awesome because I built one on my own property and it was so easy for me to find my notes
Right.
because it was in my
It was right
phone. And I'd be like, oh, look, here's all of my information.
Right. No, it's so true though, because like even this notebook that I have with just the notes for this, like there's all a little bit of everything in here. And yeah, I
Yeah.
probably to find it again is always very interesting. So it does make sense. It definitely does make sense. And regardless, it's like I just even love like if you're writing it down, document somehow, then you're good because and people don't think it's important to do that, but it is so important because you don't realize that like that note that you took 2 weeks ago, you're going to read that and it might mean something completely different than it did at the
Exactly.
10 right?
Right.
So I think that's so important. And
And you also,
so
like, most of the time when people tell you they've had an experience, you'll ask them, well, how often? They're like, I don't know. But once you
right,
start tracking it, start going like, wow, this doesn't just happen to me every now and then. This is
right.
happening to me almost every day, or this is
Yeah,
happening to me throughout my day. And wait a second, I have a lot more natural ability than I perceive myself as having.
right. Because I think too sometimes because we just need that proof, like that black and white proof, because you forget and you write, and then you wrote it down 10 times in a row, and you're just like, oh, okay, so
Right.
it's real.
Right.
It's just so true. I'm so on board with that. So in your book too, I really like that you started out with working with your ancestors,
Mhm.
because I feel that people who are just starting, and because again we've been so conditioned to fear death that it's such a great way to kind of step into it. It's like the great little segue to get you start working with, and getting familiar with the flow of it, your flow, creating an altar and all of that. So for people who have not even started or thought about doing that but they're interested, can you just give us a little bit of quick advice on how to get started working with your ancestors?
Sure. So, well, you stated the altar piece. That is probably one of the easiest things that we all can do. And an altar is really just a flat surface. It doesn't have to be flat. A vision board is technically an altar. It's just a
Mhm.
two-dimensional altar. So people who do Pinterest boards, that's technically an altar of sorts. But an altar or shrine is usually a flat surface that you set aside as sacred. Okay, so that means you don't put anything on that space unless it's intentional. You don't throw your car keys on an altar unless your grandfather was a mechanic and you're hoping he's going to help you with your car.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Yes.
so it becomes a place that is dedicated to your ancestors in the form of an ancestor altar. It can be for a particular person, like a loved one that was very close to you who died. You might have a separate one that's just for them, or you might have one that is for your whole entire family.
Mhm.
And it is a place where you can, put pictures of them. You might put memorabilia, things that make you think about them. Maybe you have your grandfather's watch, or you have an old perfume bottle of your grandmother's, those things, religious items, spiritual items, things that speak to you. And that altar, if it's for a particular person or a particular type of family, like if your family all gathered in the kitchen, then your family altar should be in the kitchen.
Right.
If it's for one person and your grandfather really loved the sunlight in your den, then that would be a good place to have an altar for him because it's going to be connected to that person. Okay. And we can leave offerings of, things that they like on our altar. So food, drinks, disposable things, cigarettes, flowers. We do need to clear it off because they're not going to physically partake of those items. They are an energetic offering. So after a day or two, you really do have to clean that stuff off of your altar. But also you can honor your spirits by talking about them. To be quite honest, that is their favorite thing, is they want to be remembered. So if you're missing your mom and you're making cookies with your kids, talk about how this was her recipe. Talk about how when you used to make cookies when you were kids, and you will start to feel that person in those moments because you're pulling them to you with your remembrance. And also, we teach our children, especially if you're interacting with your children with this, we teach them how to remember. So, like, regardless of whether they are naturally psychic or not, they still can know who your relatives are. Like, I was going through with one of my cousins who she's quite a bit younger than me. Her mom was only 7 years older than me. So she's actually a year younger than my youngest child. But she has all sorts of family pictures because her mom had them and her mom has passed. And we're going through them and I'm like naming off people so that she can write on the back of it. And she's like, how do you know these people? And I was like, well, first of all, I grew up, I'm older than you, so I'm here. But I also knew some of them who maybe I only met once or twice, or maybe I didn't. But because my family really kept sacred storytelling as part of how we honored our dead, we talk about our dead all the time. My grandchildren know who my father is and who my great grandmother is. They know stories about them. They know things about them that make them unique. And that is one of the easiest and most beautiful ways that we can honor our dead, is by talking about them.
Yeah. And, again, it's just one of those pieces that I think that sometimes people, don't talk about them because it's painful for them. But again, they don't realize that by doing that, like you said, like if you're making those cookies and you're thinking about your mom if they pass, and you're talking about that, you're bringing their energy right into your space, and that's going to offer comfort. So I think, it's so important. I think that, you definitely just like the storytelling too. And that's something I feel like that has has been forgotten rather. And, I try to do that with my kids, with different relatives. And my husband's grandmother they were very, very close. Super Brooklyn Italian lady. And, so the kitchen was her spot, and so a lot of times we'll be in the kitchen, nobody's cooking, but we smell fried chicken parm. And I will be like, whoever's around, I'll be like, everybody come in here, because I'm going to tell you, stand right here and tell me what you, and not, and all my kids are pretty perceptive and they will all smell it. They all will know. And I'll say, well, Nani's here. So maybe, maybe today we got to make some chicken parm because she's hanging around. Right. And it's like, why not do that? Why not include that? And, and even like when they were little, it was so cool to see their faces, because they would, and they're so much more open. The kids are so wonderful to work with kids because it's so easy, because they're just like, oh yeah, oh, I see that person, or I see, and it's a spirit, but they're like, oh yeah, they're right there. Oh, I'm talking to Uncle Bob, and they don't think anything of it. And it's so great, because you're like, and then it's like, oh good, somebody else sees them besides me. That's nice. That makes me feel better. But just that, the excitement that they get. And I think sometimes having kids around and including them in that, then you can kind of tap back into that,
Absolutely.
To that self, because sometimes we need that. And maybe that's why it's happening, right?
Well, I also think that there's a lot, like we're going through psychic evolution, and that there is a lot more people who are either waking up to their psychic abilities or who are being born with more awareness. My sister and I'm 52, and my sister and I have always referred to ourselves as front runners, like people who are, had a really blessed, with the blessing of having our grandmother be our first teacher. So we got that so that we could be connected to this our whole lives, so that when people are now opening up, that, it's kind of like, oh yeah, yeah, we got, yeah,
Right. Like,
yeah,
okay.
this is what's happening. And it's why we're seeing so many more children who are so open. I actually have had multiple throughout my career mothers come to me who the mother only had, just a little bit of psychic ability, but their child had a lot. And so
Yeah.
the mother was coming and maybe, not just getting a reading, but maybe taking classes so that she could have skills to help her child who was going to need them more than she would. Because
Right.
while she could handle hers, because maybe she's just a little empathic, or maybe every now and then she knows something, but her kid's like having this full on experience,
Yeah.
And so, part of that is I just think that they have the opportunity to be more open, because the times we're living in, with going through psychic evolution, with psychic phenomenon being normal. I mean, my grandmother took care of her community under the guise of selling worms and people liking to come to her house for her cooking. Okay. But she
Love
was
it.
really talking to them about their lives, talking to their dead, helping them with medicines. You can have a podcast. I can write books. Do you know what I mean? We can have these things where we're like, no, look, we're doing this. We've got not only, a little tiny sign saying we're doing, we got a big billboard here.
Right. And we don't have to disguise it like we're,
We don't have to disguise it.
selling worms,
I was outwardly a witch who owned a metaphysical shop, did readings for the public, and was on a school board. Because we're living in a time, no, if I was living in Texas instead of Vermont, that probably wouldn't be the case. But it's still a shift, even in those places, because I have been on enough bigger things that put me out there that I have people contacting me from readings from all over, as I'm sure you do with having a podcast. And I'm having people contact me from Missouri and Texas and Nebraska, and they feel isolated. But I'm like, well, actually, I've read for 5 people from your state in the last month, because they're
Right. Yes.
clusters. And I'm like, there's a bunch of you. There really is.
No, it's so true. It is. It's so true. But I mean, I definitely relate to that because where I live, even too, I have 4 kids, so I was homeroom mom and involved with the school, and
Yep.
I'm openly aware, and it's kind of, it's a little conservative here, so I'm definitely stand out. People know that I'm different,
But they accept you.
but I'm doing it. I still do the things. I'm still, doing the activity. I mean, my youngest graduates high school next week, so we've come to an end with that, which
Yes.
I'm sad, but I'm kind of glad to be done because after 20 something years of doing that, it's time.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and it definitely is. And I write as well. I create tarot decks and stuff like that. So then that it's just funny that they ask you, it's like they want to ask you and they do, but they don't really understand what you're saying. But they're still asking. So I'm okay with that. At least it's not like get away from her, keep the kids away, and that sort of thing,
Yeah, no, it's totally like, even in my lifetime, because I've been doing this, like I said, for like 30 years. I've always managed to be accepted in my community. And, but what blew my mind was like, my first book I knew my clients would read because it was a memoir. So Jump Girl was a memoir, and I knew that people would want to read it. I'm not surprised they want to read Spirit Speaker. But when The Path of Elemental Witchcraft came out, and I had all of these clients of mine who were just normal people, not only buying my book, but taking pictures of themselves holding my book up. And I'm like, this is witchcraft on the front of it,
like, do you know what's going on here, guys?
But it really it just is more of a sign of us starting to understand that, prayer and spell work is not that different.
Right.
And in all religions, there is space, regardless of how you get there, for wanting and needing to have relationships with our beloved dead. And I have communicated with a ridiculous amount of Catholic grandmas who are in spirit because I live close to Canada and there's a lot of French Canadians who are Catholic. Um, that they are actually really skilled at it as far as spirits to communicate with because they have a really strong belief in an afterlife. So they actually are already really spiritual, even if their approach to getting there might be different than mine or, my Buddhist friends or, and it's like, and I think that death is one of those things that, it's one of those things that people will enter the magical closet for, because I will find that women will come for readings like psychic readings, tarot readings, just because they like it, they're curious, they're interested. Most men who show up, it's because things are really going rough in their life and they're desperate. Okay. But spirit communication, and maybe it's because that feeling of desperation is there. I find that while it's still women usually leading the man to the spirit communication session, they're showing up too because they also mourn deeply and often don't know how to express that because it's their job to be stoic and to hold things together for everybody else. So writing Spirit Speaker, one of my goals was to answer the questions that I am most asked by my clients. So while a person who's an aspiring medium is going to get a lot of good information for starting out of it, it wasn't just written for people who are on a spiritual path. It was written for people who were just curious about death for their own perspective because someday they're going to die or because they're missing somebody. And I think that it's through these things that we start to normalize psychic experiences in magic. Because, like if I go back in my mind to like, how are we even here today? Well, I think about John Edwards, who is a famous medium, being on the Sci-Fi Channel. Okay. Like I think that was the first like public network that was like national that had a medium on it.
Right. No, it's so true.
Clean-cut Catholic boy that he made it all work because he was so polished and he was so, and that is just like, but the reality of it is that, he could only make it work because there was already a need for people to connect with their dead.
Yeah, absolutely. And that curiosity was there. And this was like the safe way to do it, right?
Right.
Like it was easy, like, oh, okay, he's not going to tell me anything crazy. But,
Right.
I mean, I used to watch that. I always thought it was super interesting for sure.
Right. Well, I watched it too because it was the first time that it was like somebody, publicly standing out there on television and being accepted. Because then I think he moved from that to like CBS or something. So he
went to like mainstream after that. Yeah, no, and it was because like at first I'm watching it and I'm like, is this real? Like, is this
right?
I'm like,
it could be fake.
Like, what's going on here? Okay, but then I'm watching it. I'm like, all right, it's pretty good. So, and I love it in your book too that you, with each section too, you add a personal story to it. So that really helps to make it relatable and kind of, again, gives it that different perspective that it softens it a little. It's not just like, well, this is how it is, and with your experience, really, and I like that. It really does help, I think, the reader to connect to what you're saying as well. And I think that's really important, because sometimes books tend to they can read like a manual, and you can't really relate to that because you're like, all right, well, you do this and this, and it's like, well, what do you mean? And so that you have that story in there and it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. And one of the things that really stuck out too, was when you were talking about, I believe it was your friend's mother was passing away and she was in her room and she just wasn't she wasn't crossing over yet. And there was all pictures of her family members,
Yeah.
alive family members, all over her, around in the
Mhm.
room. And you had her children take them out and put ones in of ones that have passed on. And then she shortly thereafter went ahead and passed. And it's like one of those things, like you're like, you don't even think about that, and then you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense,
Yeah.
and people, I think too, tend to think that if that person, they're getting ready to pass, they're in those final stages. I don't know, I feel like people think that they're not aware of what's going on, and it's like maybe physically they aren't, but energetically they are. So like
Yeah.
even something as easy as that, just to shift that energy to that and then give that allowing, like, yeah, we're not going to keep that reminder of what you're leaving behind, but we're going to bring in all these people who are going to greet you and who are there.
Right.
If not, they're there, they may be there already, and it's
Right.
just that
This is where
confirmation.
you're going. Yeah.
Yeah, like, hey, they're all waiting for you, so let's,
Mhm.
you can go. And I thought that was a really a great point to bring up, because I've been, I did some home care, so I've been in situations like that. And the people, they're constantly trying to bring in all these people that, oh, they're all here, but it creates that,
Yeah.
it's just not the right
Also
dynamic.
why some people die moments after somebody leaves the room, because some
Right.
people don't want to let their family down. They can't,
Yeah.
or you can think of it even as kind of like a form of stage fright, like I can't do this while you're watching me.
Right.
Um, and people do, they get stuck in this feeling of obligation. And when you have somebody who's got long-term illness, who's near the end, they might only be half in consciousness most of the time. And if every time they're surfacing, they see all of the people who are rooting for them, or all the people's pictures of that they're leaving behind, then they are going to have more of an anchor to this physical world.
Right.
Where when we start to shift their perspective, like you were saying, like to all the people who are waiting for you, to like, you give them, when their consciousness comes to the surface, a different thing to think about.
Right. Right. And and I think too, with doing something like that, it also kind of, it makes it not about you as in the person who is alive and well. You're making it
Mhm.
about that person who's ready to pass over. And I think
Right.
that is another really important thing to do, when you are comforting some, being there for them, sitting in vigil for them, is remember it's not about you.
Mhm.
It's about them. Like, you're going to be here next week. They're
Right.
not. So it's that separating that
Yeah.
part to really think about that so that it can happen. And, and even the part where you kind of mentioned too about when people pass, sometimes when someone walks out of the room, I think that's another point that's really important too, is some people want to die alone. They don't
Yes.
want an audience, and they will hang on and hang on. Or it's when they pass right as everybody leaves for the night, or
Mhm.
right before everyone comes in the morning, or in, like, there's, if they're in a hospital setting, they wait until everybody's out of the room to do it,
Right.
and I think again too, that's just touching on that it's really not about you, because for some reason too, I feel like a lot of people feel guilty that they
They
weren't
do. They do. They feel like they've done
there.
something wrong. And I've had so many times in, spirit sessions with people, where their dead loved one will come through and tell me, like, I died alone, or my daughter had just left the room. And I'll start with that. And then they'll immediately say, I don't want them to feel bad. They've been beating themselves up over this. But
Mhm.
this was my way. This
Right.
was, I waited for them to walk out of the room. I couldn't do this. I couldn't be there doing this in front of them.
Right.
And, because you're right, so many people do, they carry guilt. They carry guilt over even thinking that they wish their loved one would die. So, like, when we're doing long term care and we're exhausted and our loved one is in a horrible state of quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
And we're tired, and somewhere in our mind we're just thinking like, I just wish that they would go.
Right.
Okay. And then they die and the guilt sets in. And
Mm-hmm.
again, one of the first things that the spirits that are involved in that say usually is, please stop feeling guilty.
Yes.
Like, you weren't wishing me dead because you hated me. You weren't
Right.
wishing me dead
Exactly.
because you're wishing me to pass on because I was suffering and you were suffering. Because
Exactly.
often when we're taking care of somebody who's in a critical state, the caregiver is also suffering.
No, it's so absolutely true. And it's just like I feel like so many times, like the first message when you are speaking with any sort of beloved dead, it's like the first. I feel like it's always like almost one of the first messages, like, don't feel guilty anymore. Don't feel bad about this. Like, it's okay. And for me, even my godfather, who I was super super close with, passed away about 5 years ago, and he lived down in Long Island. So I went down there when I knew he was sick and everything. And, and he was kind of at the end, but I had to get back, and I felt so guilty about it, like, oh, I should be here. I should be here. So of course, a couple days later he did pass. And honestly, the first thing, it was like 5 a.m. There he was. And he was like, I didn't want you there.
Well, yeah.
And I was
Thanks a lot.
and his nickname, we called him Weeb, because he was like a big guy. So it was always a joke, like, weebles wobble, but they don't fall down.
Gotcha.
So we always called him Weeb. And I was like, Weeb, that's so mean. He's like, no, I don't want you to see that. I didn't want you
Right.
to see that. I wanted you to remember me how you remembered me since you were a little girl. And I was just kind of like, okay, fine. But I did feel so much better. And the thing is that not everybody is as open and receiving to that. So I think that, just if you are, if even just anything we've talked about has just resonated and you're curious, that I think you need to get this book, because it's going to really help open you up to it. Because obviously, if you're here, if you're listening to this, if this is interesting to you, you kind of already started on that journey,
Yeah.
and we're here just to kind of push you along. But I think that,
Normalize it. We're normalizing it.
yeah, and that too.
Talking
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, because it's okay. And someone passing and someone dying, it's okay. Like, we can say that, and we can be like, this, family member has been suffering for the last year, and
Right.
their body is just so done. Like, it's okay to be like, you know what? I want you to go. It's okay to go, and I think, again, like you said, just normalizing that is so, so
Well,
important.
I think that people don't want to be forgotten.
Right.
And so one of the things that is helpful is to start remembering your dead, because then you're building patterns that make it easier for you to be remembered as well.
Right.
And this is, part of it. We have alienated ourselves from, spirit. I think that there's a lot of things that, like, we've stepped away from organized religion. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but a void has been created because of that. Because, especially in the United States, we had basically an assigned religion at birth. If you
Yes.
religion, you were still Christian because you had Christmas and Easter, right?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
and you maybe went to weddings in a church.
It's so true.
So that was just an acceptance, and it meant that even if you didn't really have a belief system, there was still a vague belief system.
Right.
And then as we began to separate ourselves from organized religion and realize that it didn't work for everybody, many people left because they were angry. And because they were angry, they didn't know how to, or even for a while, they go through a stage where they don't want anything that has any spiritual nature.
Yeah.
And when they do want something, they don't know where to find it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we really have been struggling with is that. And with that goes, like, how do we deal with death? How do we deal with the afterlife? How do we deal with that whole process? Thankfully, we have things like the death doula movement, which I think is awesome,
Yeah.
that is coming about and is helping people to like ask those questions like, what does your godfather want in his death? Does he want, does he want privacy? Does he, only want a few people caring for him at the end of his life? Or does he want to see all his family? Does he want like a huge music track at his funeral? Like by normalizing those things and asking those things of ourselves, we start to think about an after. There
Yeah.
is an after.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And, and I think too, being able to discuss that with, I mean, if you are able to, because there are obviously situations where someone dies suddenly and there's not,
Right.
there's that. But if you're able to have that time and, like you said, prepare those things, it kind of almost just in a practical sense helps kind of relieve exhaustion for you because you're not like, I don't know what to do. And you're emotional,
Right.
you're tired, and you're like, I don't. Now it's like, oh, well, he wanted this, he wanted this, he wanted this, and it's done. And then you can just like go with whatever else is going on and talk to others instead of just being in your head like, I don't know if this is right. And again, the guilt, kids like, oh, I don't know if they wanted this outfit or this outfit, or did they want to be washed after, or did they want, and it's like now you can
Right.
kind of answer those questions. And again, I think that helps with the grieving process as well.
It does. It does. And I also think that by normalizing death, we have to remember that, like you said, that you worked in OBGYN. So you worked in birth, which is also another time period in which the veil between the worlds is thin because spirit is taking physical form and coming into our world.
Right.
And in death, we are leaving physical form and going into the spirit world. We're in that transition. We need to be able to celebrate death in many ways in the same way that we celebrate birth. We need to be able to see it as part of life. So, I really think that in the 1950s with television, we really tried to homogenize what it meant to be, well, I say American, but I just recently did a podcast yesterday with a British man, and he was saying it's their country too. It's not just the United States, but we tried to in the 40s and 50s to really homogenize what it meant to be of the modern world.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Like across the board. Absolutely.
Right. And that was done through television primarily. So all of a sudden, here are your images of how we celebrate the holidays. Here are your images of how we deal with death. And that's, it's over and done with behind closed doors. Like, oh, we went to the funeral. So sad.
Right. Okay.
Right.
What's next? Well, I mean, and I think even that goes along with just birth as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because, a lot of our mothers had like the twilight birth, and
True.
And, and if you think about, I mean, being an OBGYN, I know exactly how it went about. And I don't think a lot of people understand it, but it's like, why would anybody want to do that to anybody else? Like, why wouldn't you just let someone push their kid out? Or if they needed a C-section, whatever,
instead of it, everybody gets medication and everybody.
Right. I mean, these women would be so completely out of their mind that the nurses were pushing the baby out for them.
Yeah.
And so that experience was completely taken away from them.
Yep.
Whereas then you can just flip it over into the death part of it, whereas everybody leave the room, they're about to, shut the door. Yeah, everybody close the curtain, and it's so interesting because it's different but the same. Like you said, it's that different but the same, but it's that same type of situation. So now we have births and some places you can do a home birth. You can have your significant other in there. You can have family members, or or do a tub birth or whatever. And so now it's like more like normal. So why isn't that being translated into death?
It is, but it's just,
but it's I mean, it is just slow going, because normally, I mean, even now, even just with the funeral homes, like for me, going to a Catholic wake, oh, I'm just like, what is going on right now? Like, it's just so impersonal to me, and it's just so, and it's exhausting for the family members.
It is.
And
the reality of it is whether it's, it's the fakeness of it too, because to be quite honest, I understand the need for funeral homes, but they also take away a level of personal connection,
right?
Because they aren't welcoming to anybody. Nobody wants to go hang out.
You just walk into one, even if no one in there is dead, you walk into it and you're like, oh, okay. And it's almost like they took like the 50s sitcom and they stuck it into funeral homes.
Yeah. Now, do you think that there's places that are changing that? Vermont is one of the places where, home death is acceptable. Right. And you can actually, there's one crematorium. It is in the town that my office is in the state, that you can bring your own bodies to. You have to have had a medical examiner, nurse, or somebody sign off that this person is dead and stuff, but you are able to drive your own loved one. If they have to be in a box, a box, it could be cardboard, or it could be wooden or whatever, but you
so some preparations needed, but it can happen.
So you can do it. You can do it. And you can actually, there's also, because I've been involved in a lot of unusual deaths because of that, where people were able to care for their body at home, to do their, you got to get an awful lot of dry ice. So it's not easy. When somebody is wanting to do that, it's usually a long death, like you said, where there's a lot of preparation. It's also usually something that the person themselves has done a lot of preparation for, the person who's dying. Like, this was really their desire or their need.
Yes, because I think that's like the driving force of it. Most times,
it has to be like, this is how I want to be, or this is. And we actually have an epidemic when it comes to death right now. We're living in a time that is considered exceptional death, particularly of young people, and through mental illness, through things like suicide and addiction. And I was out on Gaia for an interview in the beginning of May, and we were talking about this, and the host had a recent death in their family and was telling me that their father had been basically in storage for weeks, and that Pfizer has literally warehouse storage buildings because there's not enough crematoriums.
Wow.
So there's actually a shortage. Her father was actually missing at one point. Pfizer didn't know which of their warehouse they had him in.
Oh my God. I could not imagine that. Oh my God, that's awful.
It is awful.
Oh my gosh, and that's a phone call.
Right. But this is where we're at when it comes to death. We have less people who are, becoming undertakers.
Yes. That is true. I read an article about that as well.
We have more people who are dying because the boomers are a very large generation and are moving into that. So, it's not to say that we're all going to do home deaths, but we are going to find that it is a more common thing as we're going forward, because of necessity, not just because you're the person who thinks that's what you want, but because we have hospital shortages. We've got all of these things that are going on that are making us have to evaluate death and dying.
Right.
And, both on a spiritual level and on a practical level.
Right. Excuse me. No, and I think too that by, again, normalizing these things and, being more open to it, it'll kind of help that process too, and make it so that it's a little more, I'm going to say inviting to everybody, but it isn't like so scary that we got to close it behind the door and be done with it, and that's, I think that's really an important point. And I love that, and in your book too, you really make sure to explain these things and why it's important and why it's good to do this stuff, and not just push it aside, because it's not even always, you know, and I say it's not about you, but it's also is about you on the other side, like the
Yes.
aftercare. Okay, now this person's passed on, they're good, like
Right.
they're good, you know.
Right. Now
Now
how do I
how
take
are
care of
you?
me? Right.
Yeah, exactly. So
And
I
the
think
deep
that's
breathing.
really,
I
really
also think,
important.
though, that that's one of the things that's interesting is mental health is changing,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's around grieving or whether it's just around grieving what's happening in our world, because really we have a deep level of grief. So whether it's in mourning or whether it's grief for the planet or grief for, you know, our current social structure, whatever it is, we are dealing with a tremendous amount of that. And we don't really know how to properly experience that.
Right.
We have to kind of like, and that's another reason why we have to start having these healthier discussions around death and around, you know, creating space for people to have relationships with their beloved dead, because that is a huge form of strength for people when you do have a relationship with your ancestors. All of a sudden, when you're facing that, you know, financial struggle or health struggle yourself, you now know that you have enough knowledge of the afterlife to understand that you can call upon your relatives and that they are standing with you, that you're not. I always joke and say, like, anytime I have to do anything that would make me nervous, I always take a moment to remember or to look and see the, you know, posse that is
Yes.
coming forward with me. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's
Yes,
not
you
just
have a crew.
me.
It is there. You
Right.
have a crew.
It's not just me. It's, but that's what I'm saying is we all
Right.
do. We all have
Yes.
a crew.
We do. And really being more mindful and open and tapping into that, it really you know, can enrich your life too, and then to pass on that legacy of that to others, even if you don't have children. You know, maybe you have nieces, maybe just clients that you have, and you might spark something in them that's like, oh, okay, I do need to carry this on,
Right.
you know. So we are, I feel like I keep talking to you for
Yeah.
like another hour, but we are at an hour, so
All right.
I'm going to go
Awesome.
ahead and wrap it up. But would you go ahead and just tell everyone where they can find you if they'd like to work with you?
Sure. You can find me through my website, which is salicrow.com. That's salicrow.com. And if you go to my website, you'll be prompted to sign up for my newsletter. I highly recommend it because I blog every week just about. And then there's at the end of my blog is always a list of workshops and opportunities to work with me. But you can find all of my events and my offerings on my website as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Congrats on your new book.
Thank
Um,
you.
and it's available now. So, everybody, if you want to get it, go to your favorite bookstore and do that. And also, once you do get it, make sure you review it. That's very important for us
Yes, thank
authors.
you.
It's very important for the publishers, and it really does help out. It's a quick 5-minute review, works wonders. So, please make sure you review your books. All right, everybody, you have a great day today, and I will talk to you all very